right. Good evening. Welcome to Westland Public Library. It is my privilege to welcome Ghassan Zeineddine, a 2024 Michigan Notable Books author. My name is Marissa Lasov-Santos. I am one of the Adult Services librarians. Tonight's event is just one of many taking place all over Michigan as part of the 2024 Michigan Notable Books Author Tour. The 13 authors on this tour are either from Michigan and/or have written books about Michigan. Please visit michigan.gov/notablebooks for more information. Before we begin, I would like to thank tonight's sponsors, the Library of Michigan, the Library of Michigan Foundation, and Michigan Humanities, an affiliate of the National Endowment of the Humanities. I also want to thank Susan Murphy of Page's Bookstore in Detroit for making Ghassan's book available for purchase. And now on to tonight's program. Ghassan Zeineddine is the author of Dearborn, a collection of short stories that show the diverse range and complexities of the Arab American community in Dearborn. Ghassan was born in Washington, D.C. and raised in the Middle East. He is an assistant professor of creative writing at Oberlin College and co-editor of the creative writing nonfiction anthology Hada Baladuna, Arab American Narratives of Boundary and Belonging. He lives with his wife and 2 daughters in Ohio. Please join me in welcoming Ghassan Zeineddine.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Marissa, for the lovely introduction, and thank you to the library here for hosting me. It's such an honor and pleasure to be here. There's so much organization that goes into these events, like so much hidden labor. So thank you, Marissa, and to the library. I really appreciate it. Thank you all for being here. It's a real treat for me to share this space with you and to talk about Dearborn. And there's also a former student from University of Michigan Dearborn is in the audience, so it makes it even extra special. I really like these forums because it gives me a chance to interact with you all. And I can talk about the book. I thought what I would do is kind of have an informal conversation with you all and then read excerpts from the book and kind of go back and forth. So I placed the book at the podium. So what I thought I would do is so the book is called Dearborn, as Marissa was alluding to. It's a collection of 10 linked short stories, all set in Dearborn. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with Dearborn. We're not too far away. And so it has the highest concentration of Arab Americans. I thought I would first begin this evening by discussing my relationship to the city, and then why I chose to write about it, and then I'll read some excerpts from the book. So yeah, as Marissa was saying in the bio, I was born in Washington, D.C., but I grew up actually in Saudi Arabia. We are Lebanese, and the only reason we were living in Saudi Arabia was because there was this really gruesome civil war in Lebanon from 1975 to 1990. So it was really difficult for my parents to live in Lebanon and raise a family there. So we were just in Saudi Arabia. In 1990, we actually emigrated from Saudi Arabia to Washington, D.C. And the only reason we did that was the summer of 1990. That was when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait. And at the time, there was this fear that Saddam Hussein was going to invade Saudi Arabia. So my parents, like many Lebanese expats, just decided to leave Saudi Arabia. And we went to D.C. And so I went to D.C., it was in 1990, I was 10 years old. And D.C. actually has a lot of Arab Americans, especially in Northern Virginia. But from the age of 10 throughout middle school and high school, I didn't have any Arab friends. And we didn't have any connections to the Arab American community in the D.C. area. And my sister and I were the only Arabs at our school. And so my Arab American experience was very isolating because I always felt which is not uncommon with other ethnic Americans. I felt very much like an outsider, out of place. But then, as a teenager, my parents every now and then would order a big box of baklawa, you know, the sweets, or baklava, yeah, baklawa, from Shatina Bakery, the famous bakery in Dearborn, Michigan. And yeah, and I thought, like, you know, and then my aunt's husband, he born and raised in Lebanon, but he went to school at Detroit Mercy. And he had actually a family in Troy, Michigan. And he would tell us stories about, oh, you know, there's this Arab American community in Dearborn. And those shatina boxes that my parents would always order, I would see like Dearborn, Michigan on that big box. So I knew that there were a lot of Arabs living up north. That's all I knew. Fast forward years later, I was in this doctoral program in English and creative writing in Milwaukee. And I really started to study Arab American literature in depth. And Dearborn kept coming up in the novels, right? Like this Arab American city. I was like, what is this place? I remember the Shatina Bakery, my aunt's husband's stories about Dearborn. So I really started to do a lot of archival research. And then after I got my PhD, I was a visiting professor at the small liberal arts college in central Ohio. And I started teaching Arab American literature and creative writing. And I would show them all these slides of Dearborn, these videos of Dearborn, articles about the city. And I was clearly obsessed with the city, and I had yet to visit it. I literally had yet to visit it. And I was like, at that point, I was in my mid-30s. I had yet to visit Dearborn. And then a job opened up at the University of Michigan Dearborn to teach Arab American literature and fiction writing. I was like, my God, that position was almost made for me. And so I was fortunate enough to get that job. And my wife and I moved in the summer of 2018. And very quickly, I felt very much at home in Dearborn. It was such a unique experience because it was the first time in my life that I was a part of an Arab American community. And you know, in Dearborn, particularly the east side of town, it's predominantly Arab. So you can walk the streets and you see store signs in Arabic, billboards in Arabic. You know, you go into a grocery store, a cafe, you can speak Arabic. It got to the point where I'd go to, you know, like an Arab establishment. I didn't know whether or not to speak in Arabic or English with the patrons. And so, I talked about this in other interviews, but I'm not exaggerating here when I say it's really the only place in America where I feel or felt that I belong to a place because of that Arab American community. And as soon as I started to become comfortable in the city, I started to write about it. And that's where that story collection came about. And you know, I remember at the University of Michigan Dearborn, very early on, I remember, you know, so many of my students were Arab Americans, and they had, you know, born and raised in Dearborn. And I remember telling them, you know, especially in the Arab American literature classes that I was teaching, I would tell them, you know, your Arab American experience is incredibly unique, right? Growing up in an Arab American community, that's really, you don't see that often, you know. And I'd share my own experience again, which was very isolating. And now I start to think about it. I think I spoke with like envy. Like, I wish I had had your experience. So I really adore this city. And now we moved last summer to Oberlin, Ohio, which is right outside of Cleveland. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, yeah, it's a great music school. Right. Fortunately, it's only 2 hours away from Dearborn. So as you can imagine, I've been going back and forth as often as I can. I spent most of like January in Dearborn. It's a city that I'm just really obsessed with. And I think in terms of writing, I always tell this to my students, creative writing students, to write about what you are obsessed with, or what you're obsessed about, because that will show in the writing. And so I'm just completely obsessed with the city, and that's where the book came about. You know, with the book, so the cover is actually, it's from a 1953 postcard of the Ford Rouge factory. Yeah, and so, you know, the factory features in a lot of the stories. And when I was writing the book, I really didn't conceive of the book as a whole. I had to take it one short story at a time. And it wasn't until I had assembled all these stories I saw the connections, and I put them together. And every single short story has a genesis. Every single short story was just basically based on me discovering Dearborn and responding to what I saw and what I felt. So just to give you an example, the very first short story is actually the first short story I wrote for the collection. It's called The Actors of Dearborn. And I remember very distinctly in, you know, as soon as I got to Dearborn, like in 2018, there was a lot of anxiety in the community about the presence of ICE agents and how they were making a whole lot of arrests of Arab American citizens. After Pennsylvania, Michigan had the highest ICE arrests in the country. So I remember just speaking to people in the neighborhood, even my students, and them expressing their anxiety. And how, you know, and how they felt that their Americanness was questioned because of the presence of ICE agents. And that was during the Trump presidency, so there was a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric, a lot of anti-Muslim rhetoric in the environment. And so, and there was there's this diner, and you may have been to it, in East Dearborn called Hamido. And my wife and I would frequent that place all the time. And one time, 2 ICE agents entered Hamido, and they tried to intimidate the supervisor in handing over paperwork on his employees. Fortunately, the supervisor actually knew his rights, and he said, I actually don't have to hand over paperwork. And the ICE agents left. And so I was thinking, well, how do I capture that anxiety? You know, how do I try to capture it in a way that's authentic? And it just so happened in 2019, there were a lot of census takers in preparation for the 2020 census. And so I thought, oh, what if there's a census taker who's going around the neighborhoods trying to gather information? Because he has to go house to house. And maybe through that interaction, I can capture the anxiety of the community. So that's how the first short story came about. So I thought I would just give you just like a taste of it, right? So this is called The Actors of Dearborn. I'll stand here. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Was it just awkward when I went from the center to the podium? Okay, all right. All right, I'll just read a few pages. The Actors of Dearborn. Before arriving at Uncle Sam's house on the corner of Gould and Coleman Streets, Yusuf Bezzi had been canvassing the neighborhoods in East Dearborn, Michigan for over a month, knocking on doors throughout the day and late into the night, despite the heat or rain. His new job as census taker afforded him flexible hours, and at this point in his life, he preferred to be outdoors. He was 31, and although tall and slim, he had grown a small belly since he had started canvassing in early August. He blamed his extra weight on the neighborhoods. East Dearborn was predominantly Arab, and among the Lebanese population, the Bezzi family was one of the biggest. Yusuf was born and raised in the area and knew most of the people on each block, at least by face. Whenever a resident, quite often a fellow Bezzi, saw Yusuf standing on their porch with his ID badge dangling from a lanyard around his neck, a census-issued laptop in his hand, and a census-issued briefcase hanging from his shoulder, they quickly invited him inside, sat him down in the living room, and brought him a glass of soda or lemonade mixed with orange blossom water, followed by a salty snack or perhaps a dessert and a cup of Turkish coffee. If it was around lunchtime or dinner, he was fed, and fed well. If Yusuf had refused the food, he would have offended his fellow Dearbornites. After dusk, when the men and women sat on their porches or in their open garages to smoke a hookah, sip tea, and crack pumpkin seeds between their teeth amid the fireflies flickering in the air, Yusuf was urged to take a seat and enjoy a puff from the hookah. The wind carried the scent of apple-flavored tobacco, Children ran across the lawns and rode their bicycles down the sidewalk in the streetlight, filtering between the trees. Every so often, a car blaring Arabic pop music thundered past. The modest brick houses were built so close to one another that Yusuf could simply cross the driveway and step onto the next person's property. I thought you were working for Ford, many folks told Yusuf. I don't need Ford, he said, feeling emboldened. He had previously worked in the communications department at the Ford Motor Company, where he had languished for years in a cubicle until he was laid off in the latest round of cuts. Yusuf's new job was to verify addresses and update residents' information in preparation for the 2020 census, but he often went off script. Are you happy in life, he'd ask? Have you become what you've always wanted to be? I didn't know the census was so personal, one resident said. I'm here to listen, Yusuf said. When Yusuf came across his former high school classmates, they all greeted him as Broadway Joe. Uncle Sam had given him this Americanized nickname back when Yusuf was a teenager and dreamed of acting in Broadway plays. Yusuf had starred in all the plays staged at Fordson High, sometimes even performing female roles. According to Mr. Emerson, his English teacher and theater director, his most memorable performance was as Abigail Williams from Arthur Miller's The Crucible. I don't understand this acting business, Yusuf's father had told him after the opening night of The Crucible. Yusuf's parents had sat in the first row, horrified at seeing their son dressed as a witch. You're a man, Yusuf. A man. Be like your brother. At the time, Yusuf's older brother was a starting fullback on the varsity football team and known as a Lebanese Express for his ability to plow through defensive linemen. But Yusuf had no interest in sports and had never tried out for any of the teams. The head football coach could hardly believe that Yusuf and his brother were related. Guess there's only one express train in the family, the coach had said. All Yusuf cared about was the stage, the spotlight hot on his skin, the wooden floorboards squeaking beneath his feet. The Arab boys in his class and in the neighborhood distanced themselves from him following his performance in The Crucible. They thought he was too girly. Even now, Yusuf missed wearing costumes and having the makeup artist highlight his face. But he had a new role, one that came with props and a revolving stage. He kept the makeup kit in his briefcase, and every now and then, before stepping out of his car, he powdered his cheeks and forehead and put on eyeliner. As the story progresses, Yusuf goes into this house, and the house is owned by this character named Uncle Sam, who's a Lebanese American. His real name is Samia. And his nephew is living with him, and his nephew is nicknamed Rocky. And he's been taking steroids, and he's really muscular. And Rocky has this ambition of moving out to Los Angeles to be this action hero, like an action actor in Hollywood films. The only problem is that Rocky is actually illegally residing in the country. And so the story gets complicated when ICE agents actually enter the neighborhood. So I'll leave it there. If you haven't read it, just to kind of leave you on a cliffhanger.
It's fiction, right?
It's all fiction.
Okay.
It's all fiction, but based also, everything's fictional. Every character is fictional. But it's all kind of based on what I was seeing and feeling. A lot of the stories, I did a whole lot of ethnographic research in the sense of interviewing people. So the census taker, I did research on what it took to be a census taker, right, to make the character authentic. There's this other short story that I'll read from for the few pages. It's called Money Chickens. Money Chickens. I'll explain it. It's about the father in the story stores cash earnings, which he doesn't want to report to the IRS in chickens, which he then freezes because he doesn't want to. He considers those frozen chickens as safes. And I actually brought a money chicken to the reading tonight. I'm kidding, I didn't. but I wanted to kind of give you some, like, what inspired me to write the story. One is a very good friend of mine actually mentioned this anecdote, which is true. And he said he had a friend, and she, not a friend, he knew about this couple. And the wife wanted to, I don't know how she was making her earnings, but she had a side job, and she didn't want to, let her husband know about it. So she would actually hide her money inside of chickens. And I thought that was hysterical. I was like, I have to use that in a short story. But it actually reminded me, I don't know if you all have this in your own families, but it actually triggered a lot of memories where in my family, it's been a tradition, even I remember since like I was a boy, that my family would always hide jewelry everywhere, like in weird places. Like always thinking, what if a thief comes in one day? We gotta hide it so they never find it. So in less obvious places. But the key is you gotta remember where you hid it. Yeah. And so I know my grandmother had this one friend. She was Syrian American, and she would hide her jewelry inside of empty whipped cream canisters, and she'd keep it in the fridge. I just thought that was genius. Like, who's gonna think of like a whipped cream canister in the fridge? And all her jewelry was just filled with it. So, but then I realized I actually have inherited that habit. I don't have any jewelry except for like this wedding band, but what I do is, this may sound really strange, but so I have my laptop, I carry it around everywhere. I save all my documents on like Google Drive, iCloud, so I back up my documents. But still, I have this fear of like misplacing my laptop, or what if someone breaks into the house and takes the laptop. And so whenever, with the family, when we're leaving the house, what I do is I'll hide the laptop in weird places inside the house, like under the couch. My friend who told me the story about the money chickens actually recommended that I hide it in a fireplace, like in a plastic bag. So they'll never look for a laptop or anything in a fireplace. So I thought that was really genius too. So I actually I hide my laptop in very odd places. So I'll read the opening of Money Chickens. But with the premise or the idea of like stuffing money inside of chickens and then freezing them, it's funny and it sounds whimsical, but you still have to kind of, it's not enough to drive a story forward. There's got to be more to it than that. And so really the story, I'm hoping that the story is about many different themes, but one of the central themes is this relationship between a father and a son. And the father was born and raised in Lebanon, and the son was born and raised in Dearborn. And so they have different notions of home and what it means to belong to a place. So I'll just read the opening pages of Money Chickens. And it's narrated by the son. Some folks store their money in safes. Baba used chickens. I was 6 the first time I saw him shove a Ziploc bag filled with bills inside a chicken in the kitchen of our 2-bedroom house in East Dearborn one evening back in 1988. He sat at the table wearing yellow rubber gloves that reached halfway up his forearms, a cigarette dangling from his lips. The chicken lay on the cutting board. A small man with small hands, Baba had no problem thrusting his fist into the bird's bowels. He then sheathed the body in plastic wrap and placed it in the freezer. He slipped off his gloves, dropped them in the sink, and sat back down at the table to finish his cigarette. I reached inside my pocket and pulled out my pack of candy cigarettes. I loved the first puffs because I was able to produce smoke made of powdered sugar, smoke that merged with Baba's in a ghostly swirl that hung over us like a shared thought. Police sirens wailed in the distance. Baba looked out the window. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, he said. I repeated his prayer, looking at his reflection in the window pane, the plump bags under his eyes, his thick mustache with curled tips. His face sagged with exhaustion. I had those very same bags under my eyes. giving me a somber, contemplative look for a boy so young. I'd been named after Baba's father, Ali. "There's trouble in Detroit," Baba said. He had a loud voice, developed from years of yelling over the sound of machines at the Ford Rouge plant, where he worked. Detroit was a few blocks east. "We have to hide our money from the thieves across the border." I removed my cigarette from my mouth. "Are we safe here, Baba?" "We'll be safer once we return to Lebanon. That's what the money chicken is for, to build ourselves a house back home." The money Baba made at the plant was barely enough to keep us afloat back then, not with the mortgage and the recent arrival of my baby sister. For the past month before her birth, he had been working odd jobs on the weekend to make extra cash, mostly as a handyman. But I saw him solely as a car maker. Whenever I spotted a Ford sedan or truck on the road, I suspected Baba had a hand in its making. The only home I knew was Dearborn, where I was born and raised. My parents had immigrated to America in 1982, 7 years into their home country's gruesome civil war. That evening in the kitchen with Baba, I was too young to point out this fallacy. How was Lebanon safer than America when Lebanese were killing one another in the streets? Mama entered the kitchen, holding my sister in her arms. Her long black hair was parted down the middle. She wore her hijab over her shoulders like a shawl, always prepared to wrap it around her head in the event a male member came calling. She was a tall, big-boned woman who towered over Baba and me. She sniffed the air. "I smell raw meat," she said. The cutting board was still on the table. "I found a new hiding place to safeguard our money," Baba said, and explained his stuffing. Mama's eyes widened. She opened the freezer and looked inside. "Allah have mercy," she said. "Don't worry," Baba said, "the chicken is halal. We can keep your pearl necklace and gold bracelets inside of one." "I prefer the bank safe," Mama said. Baba looked at me, telling me through his tired eyes that this chicken business would remain a father-son affair. We communicated in a private language similar to the one used between lovers. I looked back, telling him I understood. We reached for another cigarette at the same time. In junior high, I sold cigarettes to the white students in West Dearborn. Every Friday after school, I'd take the crosstown bus and get off on Michigan Avenue and stand outside the Blockbuster, the comic book store, or the local hamburger joint, waiting for boys and girls my age who were itching for a smoke. The houses were bigger and more spread apart on the west side, the streets lined with oak and maple trees. I kept cartons of cigarettes in my backpack and charged $15 for a pack or $2 per cigarette because I could. Baba bought me the cigarettes. "The money will go toward our house in Lebanon," he said. He still worked at the plant then, but had given up his weekend jobs to manage his cousin's car wash part-time. I understood that our cash businesses were tax-free because we didn't report our earnings. The real thief, Baba told me, was the IRS. I was obsessed at that time with Kurt Cobain, who had shot himself in the head the year before, breaking my heart, and I sometimes used my earnings to buy CDs. If I had possessed a grungy voice or known how to play the electric guitar, I would have aspired to die young as a musical genius. But my talent was hustling. "Care for a smoke?" I'd say to the students my age. I had become a smoker myself by then. They'd look at me suspiciously. Who was this undersized teen with baggy eyes and a mustache, they wondered. And it's true, even at that age, I had a full-grown mustache. What I lacked in size, I gained in hirsuteness. My fingers and forearms were becoming increasingly furry. I'd remove my backpack from my shoulders, open the zipper, and let them peek inside. Holy shit, one would say. Whenever I spotted cops, my heart raced. I always remained in place for a few seconds after seeing them, daring them to catch me, feeling more alive than I ever had before. I was sure that Baba felt the same thrill, outfoxing the IRS. And so I mentioned they're 10-link short stories, And what's interesting about about like writing a short story collection, it certainly allowed me to capture a diverse range of characters. And that was really important because, Dearborn, like any community, any town, city, village, has a diverse range of people, that there's no one person that can represent a community. And there's no one person that can represent the Arab American experience. So the short story collection really allowed me to just show different side aspects of the city and what it means to be Arab American. Being Arab American means something different for according to the person you talk to. And it also allowed me to, and this is where I had a lot of fun as a writer, to try to capture many different kinds of voices. So the next short story I'll read a few pages from, it's called Marseille. And it's narrated by a 99-year-old Titanic survivor. She's Lebanese American. The story is set in the late 90s when the film Titanic came out. All my students now, my goodness, they haven't, I don't know if they've heard of the film Titanic, with Kate Winslet, Leonardo DiCaprio, and I would tell them, like, you don't understand, this film was a huge hit, like it was a sensation. And so the story is set shortly after that film comes out. And in the premise of the short story, there's this young journalist who works for like an Arab American newspaper, and he goes to interview the Titanic survivor, the 99-year-old woman. And I actually had come across this story in my research about Dearborn and just like the Arab American experience, that there were a lot of, or not a lot, but there were about over 100 Lebanese passengers on the Titanic, and a lot of them perished. And I came across this history book that provided insight into some of the passengers on the Titanic, including those who had perished in the sinking. So I thought that was really fascinating because when we think of the Titanic, you don't really always think of the immigrants who were on that boat. And I knew that when you think of Titanic, you think of the sinking, right? And I didn't want that to be the main premise of the short story. I wanted the story to be about something else, but it's linked to the Titanic. So that's where it comes into play. So this took a lot of research, but I do want to point out that it's important to get the details right. And I thought I had. So when the story had already, the collection had already been edited, and a proofreader was going over the book. And they were also serving as like a fact checker. And luckily, the proofreader, she's brilliant. She caught a mistake that I made. And that is, I had the main character and the other survivors of the Titanic go through Ellis Island. And the proofreader said, I don't think the Titanic survivors went through Ellis Island. I think they went through another port in New York. And I went back to my research. I was like, oh my God, of course. It was like, think like Port 53 in New York City. So I got that wrong, but we were able to correct it, like right on time. So I'll read the opening. So it's called Marseille because it's, this is actually one of the only short stories. It's a kind of like a frame story in the sense that the journalist is interviewing her, and he's recording her. So it's actually like an oral narrative, and she's telling her story. She lives in East Dearborn, but she's talking about her life growing up in a village in Lebanon, and then the journey from Lebanon to the port city of Marseille in France. So I basically followed the trail that they would take, the journey that they would take from Lebanon to France, and then to Liverpool, and then ultimately across the Atlantic to New York. There's this, I'm not doing it justice, there's an audio version of this book, and there's a male and a female voice actor, and so the voice actor, she's Iraqi American, and she narrates this just really well. So I can't even, my reading of it doesn't compare to hers. because the character is supposed to have a hoarse voice because she's a chain smoker, and she has a slight Arabic accent. And the voice actor just nailed it. So this is called Marseille. It's early afternoon, and it's been snowing since dawn. The young journalist from the Dearborn Post sits in the armchair before me, in the corner of my living room next to the frosty window, sipping from a mug of coffee that my caretaker made for him. His tape recorder rests on the side table between us. The neighborhood street and the roofs of the brick houses are powdery white now, turning this part of East Dearborn, where I've lived for most of my life, into a scene from a charming holiday postcard. I light a cigarette with the wine still burning in my mouth and put out the stub in the ashtray next to my glass of water. My gnarled hand trembles. The journalist seems surprised that a woman my age, 1 year shy of 100, is smoking. His name is Ibrahim, and he's writing a profile of me, a survivor of the Titanic sinking in 1912. Although 86 years have passed since the disaster, the majestic ship has been on everyone's mind since the release of the new film before Christmas. I haven't seen Titanic and don't intend to for two reasons. One, I leave home only to visit the doctor. Two, I'd rather not relive the horror of the sinking. I haven't seen the 1953 or 1958 films about the wreck either. I'm ready when you are, Madame Aida, Ibrahim says. His dark bangs are brushed to the side in a floppy arc. He wears silver-rimmed glasses, a wool blazer, and corduroy pants. He removed his bulky boots in the entrance so as not to dirty my carpet. There's a hole in his argyle sock, revealing the pink skin of his big toe. I looked at the recorder. My voice is deep and guttural. My Arabic accent clings to my English words like a stubborn child. The last time I tried to tell my Titanic story, I was in my late 20s, married with 2 children and pregnant with a third. My eldest daughter's 4th grade teacher had invited me to visit her class to share my experience. They were learning about the ship and wanted to hear my first-hand account. I stopped halfway through my presentation to the class. My memories became too painful. I didn't want to break down in front of 9-year-olds, including my daughter. I grabbed my purse and walked back home. But there's another story I plan to tell Ibrahim, not the one he's expecting. It's a story I've never told anyone before, one that I've carried with me since I was 14, my age when the ship sank in the icy waters of the North Atlantic. I tell Ibrahim to press record. I was born in 1898 in Sofa, a Druze village in the high reaches of Mount Lebanon. There was a train station in our village, not too far from the Grand Sofa Hotel. The trains passed back and forth from Beirut to Damascus. Every time I heard their mournful wails, I imagined myself on one, headed elsewhere. I had only visited the neighboring towns and dreamt of going west to Beirut and seeing the sea up close. Don't get me wrong, I love Sofa, loved walking down its narrow roads lined with limestone houses with red tiled roofs. In summer, I'd play with my siblings and cousins in the pine forest. We'd creep into terrace gardens to pick fruits. Our village had the most delicious plums and apricots. When we got thirsty, we'd hike down to the main square to drink from the communal spring. But the trains made me wonder about what lay beyond the mountain ranges. A few of our village men had left for the Americas in the late 19th century in search of fortune. One such man, Amin Fayyad, returned from Buenos Aires with hemp sacks overflowing with gold and his skin blistered by the sun. No one knew how he had made this money, but with it he built an Arabian mansion with marble floors and arched windows. I was the eldest child of 5. My family rented a 1-bedroom house down from the main road. My parents slept in the bedroom and my siblings and I in the living room. On thin mattresses we rolled at night and laid side by side. At the age of 7, I had already become a chain smoker. I see the look on your face, Ibrahim. Let me explain. You see, at the time I suffered from severe nosebleeds. I bled so much that my parents feared I'd bleed to death. The doctor in our village failed to cure me. That summer, my parents took me to a nomad camp in the woods for treatment. An herbalist rolled me a cigarette and told me to smoke it. I coughed with every puff, and my eyes watered. The herbalist rolled me more cigarettes and instructed me to smoke them all. My nose never bled again. From that point on, I kept a pouch of tobacco, rolling papers, and matches in my dress pocket. My brothers and sisters would beg me for a puff, but I told them to bug off. I've got a medical condition, I explained. That anecdote is actually has some truth to it in the sense that my wife's grandmother, who's really healthy and in great shape, she's young. She's only in her mid-70s, and she is a chain smoker. She's very slim, and she actually has been smoking. I don't know if it was since the age of 7, but from a very young age, because she actually suffered from nosebleeds. And there was like a nomad camp that came into town. They did the exact same thing, and they rolled her cigarettes and said, if you smoke these cigarettes, it'll cure you of your nosebleeds. And I guess she didn't have any more nosebleeds, but she's been smoking for like 90% of her life, and she sounds like Darth Vader. But there is some truth to that. Let me just see. Yeah, I can go on. Do you want me to take questions, or do you want me to go on with other stories? Should I see if you all have maybe any questions? I can kind of talk about other stories. I just wanted to see if maybe you all had questions. I can talk about the process too, which includes like more about the research process, or even like revising it, and all that stuff. If you all have any questions.
So yes, we'll definitely do a question and answer. So we are going to pass this microphone around because we have our city channel filming. So the microphone,
That's not working.
that's what I'm getting to. So it's only meant for the camera to pick up. So it's not going to amplify your voice. A lot of people are like, oh no, I don't need the microphone, but it's like, yes, you do. So yeah, so here, I'll stand up here. But if I could start with the first question, Ghassan.
Yeah, sure.
So the two narrators
Yeah.
for the audiobook were really outstanding.
Mm-hmm.
How were they selected? What was the process around that? How did you feel hearing your book read?
What's so interesting is that both of them are actually originally from Michigan. It just so happened. Through our publisher, we decided on which audio company we wanted, and the voice actors that they chose they're just brilliant, and they gave us samples, and I listened to them. I was just like, wow, this is incredible. So I thought they did a great job.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
Anybody else? Question? Here.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Hiam, and I've worked in Dearborn for 30 years, but I'm not actually from Dearborn originally. I'm from up north, Saginaw.
Okay.
So I came here for the job. And
Wow.
I'm still here.
Okay.
So it's really fascinating to hear about Dearborn, because I've taught there, and I've taught
Yeah.
at all the 3 high schools there.
Okay.
So I was going to ask you more about the writing process and how you got published and what publisher it is, and also about voiceovers. I'm interested in doing that too, and how you can get into that field, or even to do the
Yeah.
acting voices. Thank you.
Yeah.
And I loved your stories, by the way.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Actually, one story I didn't. So one story is actually called. You said your name is Hiam.
Yes.
So one story is actually called Hiam LLC. And I was but it's actually a very raunchy story. So I wasn't sure. If y'all want me to, I can read the opening pages. You'll know exactly what I'm talking about. But yeah, it's about this a Lebanese woman living in Dearborn, and she runs her own real estate company.
Oh,
Yeah.
I'm thinking of opening an LLC.
Read the story. But the voice actor, the writer doesn't really have any
Say in there?
say. It's like there's like the audio company buys the rights of the book.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, that's how it works. The publisher is called Tin House. Yeah, and they're based in Portland, Oregon. Yeah, yeah. And quite often to get published, you have an agent who represents you, and they sell your book to the publisher. But my story is actually really unique. It's weird. It doesn't often happen this way. And I don't want to make it seem that it was so easy. It sounds really easy, but this is after years of so much failure that I went through. So one of the editors at the publishing house, she had read a few of my short stories in journals. And it just so happened that there's this one short story that I published in this journal called the Arkansas International. And I know, Arkansas, right. It's based at the University of Arkansas. And it just so happened that the editor at the publishing house, an incredible, brilliant editor, her name is Elizabeth DeMio, she actually was a graduate student at the University of Arkansas, and she helped launch that journal. And so she was still in touch, like she still would follow that journal. And she just happened to read one of my short stories. And then she kind of like read some other stories, and she reached out to me. And she said, are you working on anything? And it literally just so happened that I had just completed the collection, it was all ready to go. It was on a Friday when I received her email, and I had even already drafted a summary of the book because I was about to market it. And I just sent her that material, and then they gave me a contract 2 weeks later. Yeah, that doesn't. And then I eventually got an agent and all that stuff. But again, that's after years of like, I have a failed novel, an agent wasn't able to sell it, and then she just dropped me. So that's after a lot of failure. It happens. You just got to be really persistent and persevere. But it's funny, one short story in the collection, it's called Zizou's Voice, and it's actually about a failed novelist. And his published, I mean, there's a piece of yourself in every, in your short stories, but like it's not me. It's not me, but he goes through a similar publishing failure, and he eventually becomes a voice actor. So I actually an audio actor, and so I researched that process, what it takes to be an audio actor. Like, what's your diet? What do you eat before performing? Because you don't want to have gas if you're about to. There's going to be like unwanted audio effects. Or indigestion. So I did all that research.
Or a phlegmy throat.
Or a phlegmy throat, exactly. So like I heard like drinking tea, all that stuff beforehand. Yeah.
Something with lemon.
Yeah, exactly.
I wanted to know, because as you were reading, boy, you just carried me away with your descriptions, and I felt like I was right there. And have you written since you were young? It's a weird, I enjoyed writing, but it wasn't like a habit. No, it didn't really become, I didn't start taking it seriously until I got to college. It's interesting because in high school, I was obsessed with wrestling. Again, I mentioned very early on that I felt very much like an outsider. But I became known as a wrestler in high school, and I didn't mind that because it was an identity I embraced. And so I had this plan of like wrestling in college. My sophomore year of high school, one of the assistant coaches, he was also a high school English teacher at the school, and he had wrestled in college for a couple of years. And so I was 15 or 16 at the time, and he gave me this essay by the writer John Irving. You may be familiar with him. It's an essay called The Half-Pound Piece of Toast. And it's about these two characters. It's a nonfiction piece. It's a real story. So John Irving was in high school, and he and his teammate and his team, they're going down from Exeter, New Hampshire to Rhode Island for this big wrestling tournament. And they're all underweight. So, in wrestling, you wrestle in categories. And his friend named Larry, who is like this really talented wrestler, and he was expected to reach at least the semifinals, he was just underweight. So they go into a rest stop, and Larry decides to eat a piece of toast. And guess what? He ends up being overweight. And he's disqualified from the tournament. And so I thought, when I was reading that story, I was like, oh my goodness, this is like, wrestling is being combined with like literature. And then I read John Irving's fourth novel, The World According to Garp. And that's about the narrator, not the narrator, the main character is Garp. And he's a writer and a wrestler. And I thought, oh my goodness, that's actually possible to be a wrestler and a writer. So that was in the back of my mind. And my parents being Arab parents, I had the opportunity to wrestle in college. And with like full rides and everything. And my parents, we were, in the DC area. This is not atypical, but they did not allow my sister or I to leave home for college. So we both went to the same school in Washington, D.C. So my wrestling career ended at the age of like 17. And so I had this void. And so I filled that void with like writing and just reading obsessively. So I really didn't become an obsessive reader until I got to college. So I would probably say until then, like 18, 19, yeah.
And one more question. It seems like there is some kernel of truth in each one of your stories, something
Yeah, there's always, right. Like
that really happened.
Yeah, or some real image like triggered it, right? So like for instance, the second short story in the collection is called Speedo Man. And it's really based on an image that I experienced. And in 2018, when we had moved to Dearborn, my wife and I were looking to join a gym. And we went to the Ford Community Center, which is in central Dearborn. And it's predominantly occupied by Arab patrons. And there's like this, like the big weight room with elliptical machines and the weight training machines. We were standing there. And then there's like this big glass barrier wall separating that room from this big Olympic-sized pool. And in the pool, I noticed there's a jacuzzi. And there were about 5 or 6 Arab men in the jacuzzi. And there were about 5 or 6 Arab women wearing bikinis. They were covered in the shallow end of the pool. And I had no idea if they were related or not, right? I didn't know if they were married couples or not. But to me, that image was really striking because there were such gendered spaces. Like 5 or 6 men in the jacuzzi, 5 or 6 women in the shallow end of the pool. And I knew that the women would not feel comfortable dipping into the jacuzzi unless the men vacated it. And they didn't. They were there for like 25 minutes, their skin melting. I couldn't believe it. I don't know how anyone can bear it after a minute. And so that image really stayed with me. And then years later, at that moment, I knew, God, I really want to write a short story set in this place. And I knew very early on, I wanted to have like 2 collective points of view. One first-person plural voice, like a we kind of voice, in like the men's voices, and one collective voice in the women's voices. And I knew I wanted like 5 husbands and 5 wives. I kind of wanted them to kind of butt heads against each other. So I knew that very early on, but I realized there's a missing link in the short story. And then years later, I came up with this idea, what if a stranger comes into town? And they're both, the 5 men and the 5 women are both obsessed with the stranger. And so the stranger is this character named Speedo Man, who looks like a 70s film star. And he wears Speedos, on the back of which are nostalgic images of Lebanon. So whenever the men see the Speedo, they're reminded of Lebanon. And the women find him really, well, actually both the men and the women find him attractive. So that's where, there's that kernel of truth there. Mm-hmm.
Is your wife Arab American too?
Well, she was born and raised in Lebanon, and she became a U.S. citizen, I think maybe a year or 2 ago.
Oh,
Yeah, yeah.
All right. Oh, here, I'll start here then.
Okay. Hey, so you said in the making of this book that you did a lot of research for the book and everything. So I was curious, pretty much a 2-parter. During that research, did things come up that put roadblocks into like ideas of stories that you had? And also, like during that research, did you learn something, surprising that you didn't know that really fascinated you? Yeah.
Yeah, that's great. Something that, well, I'll give you this one example about the research. There's a short story in the collection, it comes towards the end. It's called Yusra. And the main character, it's about a transgender butcher in Lebanon. And he was born and raised in Lebanon, and then he immigrated to the States. He's married and he has a 23-year-old son. Among his family members and his friends, he's known as Yasser. But he's always seen himself as a woman named Yusra. So years before I wrote that short story, I wanted to write this short story about a butcher. I was really interested in the trade because there's so many butcher shops, like halal butcher shops in Dearborn. And so early on, this is before COVID, I interviewed this Lebanese butcher. And right on Schaefer Road. And he had born and raised in a village in southern Lebanon. He came to the States in 1973. And his grandfather and father were all butchers. So kind of like ran in the family. And I just stayed, I shadowed him for several days. I stayed at his shop to understand how he cut up the meat, how he interacted with customers. One morning, like at 7 a.m., I met him at his butcher shop, and we drove into Detroit to the Eastern Market, where there are wholesale meat markets, and that's where he got his meat from. And so I got all those details about the trade. And then I started writing this short story about a father and his daughter. Actually, it's narrated from the daughter's point of view. And they go to this grocery store where this father is really good friends with the butcher there. And I wrote like 8 or 9 pages, and I just hit a wall. It's just like I didn't know what it was. I just couldn't continue the story. So I just put it aside. And I started working on other short stories. And so this short story came about from like many different interests. So there was that interest with the butchers. Has anyone been to the city of Hamtramck? Yes. It's so fascinating. Yeah, it's a city within Detroit, right? It used to be like this there used to be a big Polish immigrant community. Now it's predominantly Yemeni and Bangladeshi, right? And I thought, so we'd visit Hamtramck all the time. It's such an interesting city. And I thought this is so interesting, a city within a city. And there weren't many like Lebanese Dearbornites who'd go to Hamtramck. So part of me was like, oh, well, it'd be interesting if like there's a character from Dearborn who goes to Hamtramck secretly for some reason. And I didn't know what it was. So I had that going, and I had this idea of a butcher. And then I mentioned very early on that about writing this short story collection, the importance of a diversity of voices. It's really important to me to somehow try to communicate with themes related to the LGBTQ community, because the LGBT community is part of the Arab American community. And so I wanted to also try to explore that. And so then that's when all these storylines came together. I thought, what if the Lebanese butcher is queer, and what if he's the one who drives to Hamtramck? Because that's the only place where he can kind of be his true self. So in the short story, the butcher, he's kind of like this big macho, burly butcher, right? And he uses profanity and whatnot. But as I said, he sees himself as this woman in Yusra. So when he drives his van to Hamtramck, like every week, he dresses in like a niqab, it covers his head and his body. You can only see his eyes. So he dresses, in a dress and heels, but he's concealed beneath that niqab. And for just a few hours every Friday, he'd just walk around Hamtramck, because that's where he felt that he truly could express his identity. So that butcher bared no resemblance to the butcher I actually interviewed, right?
like totally different. But in that short story, the details about being a butcher come across through the research. So I don't know any. I think what was surprising was like trusting that these different storylines could somehow come together. Yeah, and I always tell like my writing students, like never get rid of anything you write because you never know when you might use it again. Yeah.
So when choosing to write about all these different types of characters, what made them important to you to write? Does that make sense?
Yeah, because, well, what made it important, right, it totally makes sense. What made it important, there are two ways to answer that. One is, I really wanted to write from, not just from different points of view, but from different generations. That was important to me too. Like, a teenager, a 99-year-old woman, a man and a woman in their early 60s, or someone in their 30s or 40s. Just to kind of capture that broad range of representation. However, early on, Dearborn, so I said, I'm Lebanese, and the central characters are Lebanese, right? But early on, I was like, Dearborn, what's so fascinating about it, it has so many different Arab ethnicities. So you have the Lebanese community, but you also have a thriving Yemeni American community, an Iraqi American community, Palestinian, Syrian, right? All these Arab ethnicities that are coexisting. That doesn't mean they always get along with each other, but they're there, they're sharing the same space. And I thought early on, oh my goodness, I gotta really do every community justice. I gotta tell, not that I have to tell those stories, but I have to represent them somehow. I just realized that's just too heavy a burden to carry. And then I was like, in all honesty, I would want a Yemeni American to tell their own story. I don't want to tell their story. That's their story to tell. Or the same goes true for an Iraqi, Palestinian, right, Yemeni. So I thought the way around it was try to give nods to these different Arab ethnicities within the story. So, for instance, in one short story, this one main character goes to a popular coffee shop in Dearborn called Pkwy House. I was just there earlier today. So in the short story, the main character is Lebanese, and she meets a former partner at that coffee shop. And I mentioned that it's a popular Yemeni coffee shop, because it's my way of trying to pay tribute to these other Arab ethnicities. Yeah.
Anybody else? Here we go.
Hi, it's the former student. So I have a two-part question. What was your favorite short story to write? And also, what is your favorite part of the writing process?
Oh, okay. Well, I know, about the favorite short story to write, it's like asking who's your favorite child. And so, they're all, I can't pick a favorite, but what I will say is there's some that I had a lot of fun writing. One was that short story I was talking about, Speedo Man, because I just thought it was just so ridiculous. And I thought, I'll just have fun with it and just be really absurd. So I just went with it. The most fun part, I actually love revising. I'm an obsessive reviser. And so I don't mind that process at all. And just to kind of give you an example, so I mentioned early on when the editor from the publishing house, she came across that short story Yusra. That was the short story she came across in the Arkansas International. So that had already been edited with a lot, I sent it to other readers before I sent it out to that journal, right? And I don't show my work until I've at least revised it 20 times. And even then, it's not ready. So I do that 20 times. I show it to 2 people. They give me feedback. I revise it again. And then it's good to kind of spend time away from work and then return to it with a pair of fresh eyes. So I sent it to the journal. They accepted it, but they had some suggestions. great suggestions, and I revised it. It was published. When the book was accepted for publication, the editor, Elizabeth DeBio, she also had some suggestions. Just because it's published doesn't mean you can't continue to expand on it for the book. And so, yeah, so I did it. I did further revisions to kind of even, to make the short story stronger. And we're getting to pretty close to the end, where we're about to send it to the printer. And there was this young intern at the publishing house, and she read the short story, Yusta. And she had this brilliant suggestion, and it was at the very end of the short story. Like one paragraph, she was like, there's a paragraph towards the end of your short story that's just not ringing true. And I looked at it, I was like, oh my goodness, you're right. And this is after so much revision, right? And it was just a matter of tweaking like one or two sentences. And it really spun the ending in a different way. And it really worked. So that just shows you, like, you can always revise. At one point, you have to let go. But I actually really enjoy the revision process. But I think I really enjoy the research process. Especially when I'm interviewing people, because I just love listening to people tell their stories. And people love telling their stories. So that's a part of the process I like too a lot. You get to make new relationships. So yeah, research, revision.
All right, any other questions? Yeah.
I wanted to ask, as also an Arab American, have you come to terms with yourself as an Arab American? Because sometimes it just takes years and years of questioning and discovery and learning your identity and where do you fit in here and there.
Yeah, I've come to know, my Arabic is good, but when I speak Arabic, I speak it with an accent. So when I go to Lebanon, people know that I've lived abroad. Yeah. So I feel like I'm an outsider in Lebanon. I feel like I'm an outsider here in the States too. Although when I'm in Dearborn, I don't. That's what's so unique about Dearborn. I just think I've come to embrace that identity. That's okay to feel. Sometimes it's good to get a different kind of perspective. And I didn't grow up in America. So I grew up in the Arab world. So for a long time, I saw myself more as an Arab than I did as an Arab American. But now we have two daughters, and our eldest daughter, she's about to turn 4. And she came from school the other day, and she was like, all my classmates have blonde hair, and why do I have dark hair? So it's like trying to explain it to her. Your hair is also beautiful.
Come back to Dearborn.
Yeah, come back to Dearborn.
All right, I think that was a really good question to end on. Thank you so much,
Oh,
Ghassan,
sure.
for coming. Just a few things. So Susan from Pages Bookstore is here to sell Ghassan's book. I'm not just saying this because he's here, but I highly recommend it. It is great. And we also have copies here in the library, and the audiobook is available on Libby, I know. I'm sure there's other ways to get the audiobook as well.
It's also on Hoopla.
It is also on Hoopla, thank you. And then also there are surveys for y'all to fill out. If you could please do that and return them to me or place them in the little alcove over there. I'd really appreciate it. Thank y'all so much. 17, 18. I was going to say 17.95.
It is, yeah.
I imagine so.
It is. Yeah. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you. Sure. Thank you so much.